Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. A couple of things before I talk about our next speaker. So many people have come to me and Ginger and saying, thank you so much for your hard work. And we're taking it. We're saying, oh, you're most welcome. But really, we haven't done, the GIA team has been incredible. They have made it so easy. Basically, all we've done is connect to our community and really brainstorm together, but really the work is to this team, so another round of applause. And I'm very excited about the next 2 years, but for obvious reasons, I'm Boricua, so yes. I want to thank you in advance because, of course, it's years since Maria, but the island is definitely doing better, but in some areas is still struggling so much. So make sure, I'm excited about the partnership. I'm excited about the investment, so make sure that when you go to my island that you spend lots of money. So thank you for that. As Indigenous people gain ground, carrying the mantle of equality, we make our mark upon the world. The art world is no different, except that much of Indigenous existence is still held hostage by the stereotype and the romantic notions of our existence, and is regarded through a post-colonial world. Contemporary art is the means by which we assert authority over our image and the importance of our stories. The wilderness of the art world is a world not meant for us, and yet we assert ourselves in these spaces as equals to other artists with stories the world has not heard. This is a quote from Gregg Deal, our keynote speaker. So that's just to give you a glimpse of what you're about to experience. I want to tell you a little bit more about Gregg. Gregg Deal is a husband, father, artist, and a member of the Lake Paiute Tribe. As a provocative contemporary artist, activist, much of Deal's work deals with Indigenous identity and pop culture, touching on issues of race relations, historical consideration, and stereotype. With this work, including paintings, mural work, performance art, filmmaking, and spoken word, Deal critically examines issues within Indian countries such as decolonization, the native mascot issue, and appropriation. Deal was recently showcased on PBS Art District and has been Native Arts Artist in Residence at the Denver Art Museum in 2015-2016, and Artist in Residence at UC Berkeley for 2017-2018 school year. His art has been exhibited nationally since 2002. Deal has lectured widely at prominent educational institutions and museums, including the Denver Art Museum, Dartmouth College, Columbia University, Virginia Tech, Smithsonian National Museum of American Art, and many, many others. If you have an opportunity, there's a photo of Gregg that was included in the December 2018 issue of National Geographic Society magazine as part of an article titled Native Americans Recasting Views of Indigenous Life. I encourage you to take a look at that. So as we welcome Gregg to the stage, I want you to think about what does it mean, because I think he embodies this very much, what does it mean to be an Indigenous person in the 21st century? This question, I think, fuels Gregg's art practice and his work. His work I've always found that is powerful, provocative, humorous, triggering, and always with a heart in the activism. So welcome, Gregg, to the stage.
It's afternoon. Hamu, nu Gregg Deal, mina nia, nu kuyui tikara. My name is Gregg Deal. I am a member of the Lake Paiute Tribe, and I am an artist and a father and a husband and a professional agitator. So oftentimes, I get an opportunity to speak a lot, and It's one of the things in what I do that I never counted on, and something that I have always enjoyed. My father has blessed me with the gift of gab, and so I'm good for it. Oftentimes I'm asked to speak about art and activism, about Indigenous struggle, about historical consideration and how that ties into my work. And so there's always some very specific subjects. And occasionally I get invited to do something like this, which doesn't really have a specific subject. And as a result, this is the title of my piece, my thing. Because it kind of feels like Dad's about to show you slides of what we did last summer, and it's like, I always like to start off talking about my family, and the reason for that is because our families are our core. It is where I find my strength, and it's where I find a lot of my inspiration as I have come to understand and realize what being a human being is and what it is to bring up other human beings in this crazy world that we're living in. So I have 5 children. My wife is a saint. She's kind of a grumpy saint, but she's still a saint because she holds it down while I do my thing. So the oldest is Sage. She's holding our youngest, Holland. It goes Phoenix in black. Grayson is my youngest son in the middle, and Maddox, who's a special, unique child, as you can tell by this photograph. And while doing all this, and in a world that's incredibly serious right now in terms of how we're navigating social issues and politics, and trying to be more inclusive and more aware of the people that are around us and the spaces we occupy, humor plays a really big role in everything that I do as well. I just want to show you guys this one image. This is Grayson when he was little, and Grayson, who's now 5, for his entire life has done this pose, which my wife has called the sideways pose. I say he's a professional leaner. And I show this because I want you guys to get a feeling of what my family is like, and all of the sort of oddities in our life that end up embodying everything. So I'm going to go through some images. And what's hilarious is that he's been doing it since he was a baby, which is amazing. This is my family. This is Grayson, who's just a funny kid. And this raises a lot of questions in terms of looking at my children and realizing that my wife is non-native. I'm half white. My father's white. My mom is native. I'm a member of my tribal community. They recognize me. They know my name. But my children are all members of our tribal community, and that we oftentimes will have, as Native people, and it really doesn't matter if you're full blood or if you're mixed, there's always this question about the validity of your existence, but you don't look Indian enough. And in the spirit of sovereignty, my tribal community has stood as a tribal leadership and has read the names of all of my children. They are all members of my tribe, and they all belong to our community, and their names are recognized despite what you may perceive them looking like. And this plays a role in the work that I do, in a lot of aspects of the work that I do. And I just want to show you some paintings and some pieces so you can just get a kind of a sense of these things. Identity plays a big role, creating questions. In this case, this piece is called Divine. I have questions about the use of Christianity in terms of creating a sense of divinity, and can that divinity exist in other places that are not inherently Christian. About stereotype, the way that stereotype informs our images, and how those images ultimately are deciding what is and what is not Indian based on the perception of somebody who is not an Indigenous person. Also looking at what is happening now. I called this the new normal because during Standing Rock, there was a number of Indigenous people that were covering their faces to keep from being seen, because the authorities were literally going and finding them on social media, finding them in different places, so that they could preemptively arrest them, or so on and so forth. So in a country that prides itself on free speech, we have people that are covering their faces so that they can skirt the responsibilities that are being thrust on them by a Western idea of what is an appropriate time to talk and what isn't an appropriate time to talk. So the new normal is that. And integrating things into my work that mean something to me but are still recognizable to non-Indigenous eyes. It looks like an American flag, but it's using elements of basket patterns and things that are from my tribe to create what I called an Indigenous flag. And then also the intersection of popular culture with popular culture. I mean, Indigenous images essentially exist within the canon of popular culture. Maybe more of a relic, but there's an expectation of what these things are supposed to look like. And what happens when I take something modern like the David Bowie lightning bolt and I incorporate it into something that is a familiar image in terms of defining what an Indigenous person looks like. And along with that, I do a lot of print work. I do work that's going to, that's meant to be provocative. It's meant to raise questions. In the case of this, it's meant to be more general. It's meant to be something that anybody can connect with. I don't think that it has quite the statement that goes along with the hashtag resist at the beginning of the Trump administration efforts, but I think that it still has that call to action of us just finding places to be happy, where we can rise up and we can put one foot in front of the other. And I've had an opportunity to create this piece as a mural on the side of the Red Line building nearby. But I'm also creating work that is about challenging those perceptions, challenging things that are perceived and oftentimes thrust upon Indigenous people. And what happens when I'm honest in that conversation? Because the truth is that there's a Western buyer's market for Indigenous art, and it's mostly subject to a small corner in New Mexico in a town called Santa Fe. And that Western buyer's market dictates what is Indian and what isn't. And so even Indigenous artists are making cowboys and Indian paintings because that's what sells. We're the only group of people in the world that has to cater our identity according to the perception of somebody who is not us. And so what happens if I take those stories and if I put those stories on canvas, if I inform them with something else that is unfamiliar? And as an Indigenous artist, that is me taking an inherently dangerous risk with my career, because I could not sell work. Somebody could be triggered by something that they see because they don't have the context of it. That said, there's a word on this next painting that may trigger, and but it's still important. This is a self-portrait of me when I was in kindergarten. It is titled Prairie Nigger, and it's titled that because that's what kids called me when I was in elementary school. This is about the story of my experience as an Indigenous person, as a young Indigenous person, having my identity forced upon me with the first racial slur that I ever heard when I was 6 years old. It is an inherently Indigenous story, but it is not familiar to Western ears or Western eyes. And so it begs the question, is it valid or is it invalid based on that perception? And in this case, there was some trouble with this image. There was some trouble convincing people that this was worth being up there. And of course, I put a brass plaque with the title on the piece so that it couldn't be censored as well. Because that's another real aspect of this, is that somebody's gonna see this and they might focus on the one word we know, and they might not understand the context of it, and they may decide that this would be something worth censoring. This is what I'm working on right now. I have reappropriated old comic book images from the 40s and 50s of Indians. In that time frame, I always think of like the Boy Scouts, like heyday, sort of nuclear family kind of situation. And I've redrawn, repurposed the images, and I've changed all the dialogue with lyrics from punk rock songs from 70s, 80s, and 90s that resonate not only with the images, but also resonates with the struggle, with the Indigenous struggle. Because a lot of it has to do with things like, in this case, death, or in this case, gentrification. And that there are some parallels to gentrification and the way that Native people were unceremoniously removed from their homelands. This song is called That's Progress. It's about gentrification, and it was by a punk band called DOA. And to me, this series is about stereotype, it's about identity, it's about this intersection of music that a lot of Indigenous people and a lot of young people who are part of my generation connected with. And but it's also about this journey for me, healing journey in terms of looking at how I grew up, how unstable that was, how difficult that was, and how this music sort of fixed that time and place, and then as a 44-year-old man revisiting those things. And so I'm in this new place where I'm no longer necessarily making the grand and important statements that are associated with being an Indigenous person, but creating work that's more personal and work that embodies the journey that I have as a contemporary artist, as a modern artist. And I've had an opportunity to do a mural of this. This is actually in the Rhino District, 5 Points of Denver. And I actually have, this image is also on, like, next to this wall, and somebody already defaced it. And I had to go back and fix it because we're in this political climate where people are just having knee-jerk reactions instead of looking at what's there and what makes the most sense. All of which is meant to be provocative and important and promote dialogue and looking deeper at ourselves, looking deeper at Indigenous people, and so it goes. So I'm actually known for performance art. This is my first performance art piece. It's called The Last American Indian on Earth. Everything I'm wearing is fake. The headdress, I believe, is made in China. All of the outfits are contrived and brought together to embody what I believe was the stereotype. And I had an opportunity to do this for a year. It started in 2013 and finished in 2014. And it was about disturbing spaces, and it was also about documenting the way people would interact with me. So this is not a posed photograph. This is a family that legitimately came to me, wanted to take a picture with me. He wanted to point at his Cleveland Indians hat while sitting next to me. And so it's this incredibly interesting and also incredibly difficult performance piece that I did of existing in spaces, embodying something that Americans are familiar with, and trying to disrupt and disturb those spaces. And sometimes the disruption of those spaces were about holding signs. This one says, "My spirit animals, white guilt." There's an enormous amount of critical thinking that goes into the work because I'm thinking about things that exist and things that, tropes that continue to carry misconceptions and misinformation about Indigenous people. After that, I did this piece, which is not called The Last American Indian on Earth. I have it not labeled correctly. It's actually called Redskin. It was a one night. There's an event in Washington, D.C., where I lived for 17 years before I moved here. And I wanted to do a performance piece that took the language that exists on the comment section of every article about the mascot debate and put it in one place. And we call those things microaggressions. What happens if I take all of those and I have 4 antagonizers, which I have in this photograph here, that talk to me in that language over the course of 6 hours, and they focus it all on me. And so it looks a little bit like this. And so it's about looking at a lot of different ways that Native people are interacting with and then pulling together a performance that makes the most sense for me. There's a little bit of suffering that happens on my end of things as well, but I think that that's part of the work. I really want to tell you guys about this performance piece. So this is called the Indian Voice Removal Act of 1879 to 2016. And the original, this was part of a massive show with the Smithsonian in 2016 that was called Cross Lines, Culture Lab on Intersectionality. And there's 40 plus artists. I believe the largest grant afforded to the Smithsonian to that date was given to the Asian Pacific American Center, which is under the umbrella of the Smithsonian. And they put together a pop-up show. And I think the deal is, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, was that they had to go out of their area of representation and have like a multicultural show 2 days over Memorial Weekend. And 40 plus artists means that there's a lot of different content, a lot of different concepts, a lot of different ideas. My original concept was to erect a teepee, as I have here, and to fill it with IKEA furniture, which didn't happen. And it didn't happen because and I want to tell you guys a story because these types of interactions are fairly common, sometimes on lower levels, sometimes on larger ones. But the upper echelon of the Smithsonian was very concerned about this show. So they brought the lead curator in to present all of the artists that were participating, their work, and what they proposed to do for this show. And so they had a problem with two artists. They had a problem with a Muslim performance artist named Anita Yo Ali. She's a Cambodian Muslim performance artist. And they were worried, and if you remember 2016, there was a campaign trail and some things were said. But that also brings out some pretty serious buzzwords, her being Muslim being one of those. So they were really concerned about how she was going to interact and what was going to happen. So concerned they brought in the Board of Regents, they brought in the Office of Public Affairs to sort of manage this thing. They were concerned what Anita was going to say to the public, and they eventually landed on only allowing her to participate if she didn't speak. And they put that in writing. I tried my best to convince her to take that to Kinko's and blow it up and make it part of her installation. But that is sort of the perception. The other artist that they had a problem with was me. And what happened was they showed one of the images from the last American Indian on Earth, and he said that there was an audible gasp in the room. And I can only assume that it was maybe like understanding what appropriation is, but not understanding the principles of appropriation. In other words, I can't appropriate myself. And so me embodying this stereotype is totally appropriate in terms of the way that I see the world and what I'm trying to do and experience. So they preemptively began to censor my work. They said that I couldn't talk about the Washington Redskins, which was not part of my original piece, but it became part of my piece by them doing that. They were concerned about how I was going to interact with the public, what I was going to say. And so it became this exercise in just throwing random crap out, seeing what I could get away with. And I told them, I said, because I didn't want them to silence me the way that they did to Anita. And I said, well, I can bring in a cultural interpreter. And they said, what's a cultural interpreter? I said, well, it's a white man that follows me around everywhere and explains to people what I'm doing or what I'm saying. So this is Jeremy, who actually was in the Redskin performance piece. He's from Central Virginia, so he has just enough of a Southern drawl. It all works out really well. And for 2 days, I turned this into a performance piece. For 2 days, we went around together, and he spoke. Somebody would ask me a question, and I would answer their question to him, and of course they can hear me. And then he would tell them what I just said. But everything was wrong. Everything that came out of his mouth was wrong. I turned my entire installation and performance piece into a live illustration of what the Smithsonian was doing to me for this process. There are power structures that are out there that are deciding what is important and what isn't important. And in my case, what is Indigenous and what isn't Indigenous. One of the things they told me that I had to do is they said I had to take my work to the National Museum of American Indians, and I had to have my work checked by the director, Kevin Gover, to make sure that my work was appropriately Indigenous. They wanted him to also check my identification to make sure that I was a real Indian and that I had the authority to talk about these things, which incidentally I have an ID card. But the fact is that I'm being culture checked. And I immediately asked, I said, do the black artists have to go to the Black History Museum? Do the white artists have to go to the, I don't know, American History Museum? Like, am I the only one that has to have my work checked? And they said, yeah. I ended up doing a couple things where that didn't happen. They required this, and then I think they pulled back on it a little bit. And what ended up happening, as artists do, is I became really good friends with Anita, and we started trying to figure out ways that we could push back without being in breach of our contract. Because a power structure like the Smithsonian, that's a very real situation where they could have said, well, you're in breach of contract, so the $10,000 that you put up front to pay for this is not going to be reimbursed. And so you're held hostage by these things, and you have to read the fine line and figure out the best way to navigate it, which is a crap thing for an artist to have to do. If you remember the title, it's called Cross Lines, a culture lab on intersectionality. And Anita and I had decided that we were going to intersect, that we were having this shared experience, and we became very good friends as a result of this. And we were having a shared experience and decided that we were going to exist together in her space. So her space, we're in the Arts and Industry building, which is right next to the Smithsonian Castle, and it's basically a big X. And at the apex of the building, there's a fountain, and they built a stage over the fountain, and that's where Anita stood, silently. And she was surrounded by 100 American flags. So the idea, and her whole concept was like, can a Muslim American be a patriot? A provocative statement in 2016, and I feel like a ridiculous statement in 2019. We had this idea that I would go and stand in her space with her, which looked like that. And it was this incredibly powerful and poignant moment where we were sharing a space because we were having a shared experience, and then realizing suddenly that we're having a shared historical experience as well. Muslims in America in 2016, Indigenous people throughout history, surrounded by a flag that would ultimately be a symbol of the oppression that's being thrust upon you, whether or not you're allowed to speak, whether or not you're allowed to have freedom in America, whether or not you're allowed to move about on your own homelands, whether or not you're allowed to conduct your own ceremonies in your own homelands, which was illegal in this country until 1978 by an act of Congress. So it became this incredible moment, an incredible moment that didn't last very long. I think it was all of just a few minutes. We decided that we would title it Existence as Protest before I was forcefully removed from her stage by the powers that be. And I tell this story because this is a good example of what it is that we are navigating as Indigenous people. When we say equality, when we say creating spaces that are allowing for narratives that are appropriate, when we really want to have a strong conversation about equity, we have to ask what that is, we have to ask what that looks like, and maybe not ask ourselves, but ask the people that are at the hand of those things. And I found this to be incredibly difficult for me because as an artist, I have a name. My name is Gregg Deal. I don't have a name that most people would expect as an Indigenous person to be able to land in a place that, when I file in for a grant, they're like, wow, like that's an Indian. We should maybe push it that way. I don't have that name. I have the name of my father, Deal, and the name that my parents gave me, Greg, which is, in my mind, an embodiment of my experience as an American, but also as an Indigenous American, and what it means to live the life that we live, but also what it means to reclaim. My daughter, that's Sage, her middle name is Huitsu. All of my kids have middle names that are in the language of my people. And so there's a reclaim happening there. But I won't deny what I have. I won't deny my name. I'm not going to change my name. I love my father. I carry that name because my father's my blood, and that's our family. They're all rednecks from Tennessee, but nevertheless. And so I've moved in my performance work into something that is just a little more cerebral for me. This is called Invisible Loss Movement. I brought my daughter into it because it's something that I wanted to do with her. I was hoping to bring more people into it, but we built these outfits from scratch. Was able to do this through the Red Line, and I was well supported there, which I'm so grateful for. But I also have to note, this is the first performance piece that I was like really, really paid to do. And that comes down to the restrictions of things. I have grand ideas. I am beholden by how much money is in my bank account, which I think most artists probably go through. But it's this idea of existing but not existing. It's this idea of being visible but invisible. It's this idea of being there but not being there. I see that as a metaphor for Indigenous people. We're like the most visible, invisible group of people in the country. And so I had created this based on that. And I've created some other pieces. This is called Invisible Eulogy, where I incorporated spoken word. And it became really more about existing in spaces, creating noise, creating imagery, and saying lines that are unexpected. I think at one point at the Tacoma Art Museum where I did this specific performance piece, I'm hitting that drum, I'm singing a song, and I stop and I say, Kevin Costner's my best friend. So playing on some of that pop culture and poking fun at some of those things. I think I also say that he saved me. And being very aware of that. But then bringing my daughter back full circle into what we called Invisible. It's still part of the same series, it's still part of the same concept. But instead, she is the one who's leading it. She's dressed in a red ribbon skirt. She's dressed in a red t-shirt that is specifically about missing and murdered Indigenous women, an epidemic that Native people are pushing against, and reading a few pieces of spoken word that she wrote. She's 13. And then reading the names of people who, women and children who have either disappeared or who have been victims of violence and murder. I am grateful to get to do what I get to do. There's not much compromise for me. I have a vision and I'm pushing and I'm continuing and always will push for that vision, but I'm restricted as well. Because as an Indigenous person, Americans are just simply not equipped with all of the information that they need to understand everything in full context. And I'm not really in a place where I want to build that context for everybody all the time. I don't want to have to take you along by hand and explain to you the basis of Indigenous experiences in America, only to have that somehow undermine what I'm doing. The first time I did this piece, when my daughter and I did it, people were saying, well, what does the dance mean? Well, what does this beadwork mean? And why are you wearing your feathers that way or this way? And I had to put a stop to it because this isn't about ceremony, this is about art. And I'm informed as an artist by my identity as an Indigenous person. And so if I'm informed by those things, you're not looking at something sacred, only as sacred as art can be, but instead looking at dance or looking at the outfits in the aesthetic application of those things as a viable piece of art, modern art, or even just the textiles that we built to create these outfits that are just completely black. And so instead of romanticizing or believing that everything has to have a purpose, everything has to have a meaning, why not look at it as a viable piece of art? But we are up against these stereotypes and these misconceptions, and we're up against these things that have not helped informed non-native people to what we're trying to do. It undermines our ability to be contemporary artists. It undermines our ability to be able to do things without providing context. And it also creates a space that doesn't allow understanding that I can be an American and I can be a human and I can also be Indigenous, that I can be informed by these things. I can go to ceremony, I can sing traditional songs, and I can listen to Kendrick Lamar as well, that these things are not in a vacuum, but that we are informed by a settler colonial society, but we're also informed as human beings, as Native people, and it creates incredibly rich art with incredible narratives that go along with that. I've stopped applying for grants. I stopped applying for grants several years ago, specifically because I don't get grants. And I found it to be a waste of my time to pay the fee or to do the application, to write the artist statement, to provide all of the many things that we have to do those things, but have instead built relationships with people like Redline who sees the value in the work and will help me get to where I need to get to. And so there's another question I think that comes up as providers of and makers of grants is how do you identify people? How will you identify people? How can you take work like this and put it into spaces and areas that have not been traditionally built for people like me? And it doesn't have to be me. It can be any Indigenous person that's out there. But this is the struggle because we're strangers in our own homelands. How crazy is that? That these are the homelands of my people, and we are considered to be strangers. We're considered, this country's so twisted that I'm oftentimes looked at as being a foreigner in my own homelands. And so I stand here as somebody who I feel incredibly blessed to be doing what I'm doing. And I think like any artist, it's been a hard road. And I have no complaints at all. I have been fortunate to come into contact with people and to meet people and have opportunities and to seize those opportunities and to do things with them. But I can tell you that there's an underlining thing that exists when people interact with me and when they ask these questions. And one example I'll give in closing, I was interviewed during that Smithsonian piece in 2016, and this person was from New York, and she said, "So you're a Native American artist?" I immediately knew she was getting at, and I said, well, what do you mean? And she goes, well, like you show your work in Santa Fe, you do, she was very specific, and I said, I've never shown my work in Santa Fe because that's not a market that I really care to be in. I care to be in markets that are purely contemporary and purely modern, sort of in their context and in their inception. And she's like, well, but that still makes you a Native American artist. And I said, can I ask you a question? When you talk to a white man, do you ask him if he's a Euro-American artist? Because if you don't, then we have a problem. Because I'm an artist, a contemporary artist, that just happens to be Indigenous. I'm informed by my indigeneity. I am not defined by it through your eyes, which is a hard road, and that's a hard thing to help people understand, but it's still an incredibly true thing. But I hope that helps a little bit. I hope that gives some context to some things. And I'm grateful to be here, so thank you for having me.